Joining us now is Professor Anita Hill, Law and Social Policy Professor at Brandeis University and the author of Believing, Our 30-Year Journey to End Gender Violence, now out in paperback. Professor Hill, it is wonderful to see you again. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Well, we have this Senate race, which is now exploding, a very highly contested race, of course, in the state that decided the last election, arguably, as well as the Senate, control of the Senate, certainly. Your reaction to Herschel Walker about this issue of abortion and the proliferation of laws denying women control over their own bodies across the country, as well as what is apparently hypocrisy in this case?
Well, there is apparent hypocrisy, but, you know, one of the things that I think is we should take note of is that we are now talking about these issues. You know, the fact is that the issue is being raised. It's significant. It's getting people's attention. We know that the majority of the public is in favor of women having the right to an abortion. And I think this is going to be one of those tests for how meaningful that majority's opinion is. So I don't, I don't see this as something that is going to go away. I think that people do care about this issue, and maybe more importantly, they care about the integrity of the individuals that they're going to be sending or not sending to Washington, D.C.
But then you've got Senator Rick Scott. He oversees the Republican campaign arm, raising money, of course, for all these candidates. He was asked about Herschel Walker earlier today by Hugh Hewitt, the conservative radio host. Let's listen.
This is just textbook 101 for the Democrats. They know they're going to lose. Herschel Walker's running a good race. He's a great candidate. Raphael Warnock is Joe Biden. And, you know, it's just this lies, cheat, and smear. That's what the Democrats do. They did it to Brett Kavanaugh. They did it to Clarence Thomas. They're doing it to Herschel Walker. But he's going to win.
And so, again, bringing up, you know, Clarence Thomas, we're going back to 1991 as someone who was, you know, lied about and demeaned. And, of course, this has been well litigated over decades and decades as to the accuracy of your allegations.
Well, you know, what I hear is an attack on women being able to bring forth information, talk about their experiences, and be taken seriously. That every time someone comes forward with an accusation that people don't want to hear, that they're accused of smearing the individual who is the subject of the complaint. I see this as another way of diminishing our experiences, a way of diminishing our credibility. And I think we, in 2022, that we see through this. We're no longer able just to sit back and take this, but we will continue to tell our stories and let really the public and maybe even in this case, the voters decide whether the information is credible and whether it is important in the decision that has to be made in November.
You know, the Supreme Court kicked off its new term, of course, this week with the 6-3 conservative majority. But one of the three now is the newest justice. And she is certainly already proving she is not going to be a silent presence. So you've had 2 days of oral arguments and one very important case, the Alabama voting rights challenge that was argued yesterday. And she basically gave a tutorial on the history of the voting rights record, not so much for her fellow colleagues, perhaps, but for the Alabama, Attorney General who was making the argument. It's just amazingly different to see a black woman justice and someone participating the way she is. What was your reaction to all of that?
Well, two things. I'm reminded of the fact that, she was a clerk for Justice Breyer in 1999, and there were significant cases decided in 1999, and one of which, the U.S. versus Morrison case, where really the majority gutted the Violence Against Women Act. In that case, Justice Breyer wrote a dissent. I'm sure she was part of at least the discussion, if not writing the dissenting opinion in that case. I think we are going to have to keep in mind two things. One, Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the Vance versus Ball State case in 2014 cautioned us that her conservative colleagues were on an unrestrained course to limit equal protection, to limit civil rights protections. And we're seeing that happen. We saw it in Dobbs. We have the potential for seeing it in an important education case coming up. We, of course, want to be cognizant of keep that in our minds when we see what happens in this voting rights case, because we already have seen that the restrictions on voting rights are being upheld in places around the country. I don't see her simply talking to the Attorney General of Alabama. I think that the information that she was sharing really was a conversation with the American public, because the American public is concerned about the direction of the court. They're concerned about the credibility of the court, lowest public approval ratings in decades, maybe ever. And so those moments where she and her colleagues, Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor, have an opportunity to be vocal and to be instructive and to provide information the public needs to really understand the significance of the decisions that are going to be made in this term alone. I think those have to be taken, and I'm excited to hear what each of them have to say.
No, it's so true that she was making the point that race has to be a determinant, because that's what the voting rights law in 1965 was, although it was largely decimated in 2013. But what's left of the voting rights law was to redress everything that had preceded about race. You just pointed out, there's a 20-point drop in the support legitimacy of the Supreme Court. This is what Elena Kagan said just last month.
Law gives rights to people that people ought to be able to rely on. It just doesn't look like law when, some new judges appointed by a new president come in and start just tossing out the old stuff.
So the legitimacy of the court has been raised in public now by Justice Kagan. It was rebutted in part by the chief. But do you think we've reached the point where we should revisit the lifetime tenure and the justices' ability to make their own decisions about recusals and ethics?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is to look at the confirmation process. We've seen it at its lowest point in recent cases or recent situations involving confirmation to the Supreme Court. We saw it with Justice Jackson's confirmation hearing. Where we go from there, I don't know. I don't know that ending a lifetime appointment is where we should be going, because we really haven't studied it enough to see what the impact that will take. We have these suggestions that we should enlarge the Supreme Court, but to me, that's a game of, it just depends on who's in power at the time the court gets enlarged as to what we're going to have, as a result of expanding the court. So I think we need to do a lot of thinking, but I think we have to be clear that part of the lack of confidence in the Supreme Court today is due to failed confirmation hearings. Failed confirmation hearings in the sense that what we are doing in those hearings is not necessarily getting accurate information and complete information. We've limited investigations. In the Jackson hearing, we used distraction as a tool instead of giving the public a sense of what kind of judge Justice Jackson was going to be. In the Thomas hearing, we restricted information about Justice Thomas, and in the Kavanaugh hearing, we did the same. And so that is a procedural problem that is really casting a shadow all over the entire court and our legal system.
Professor Anita Hill, your perspective is so important. Thank you very much. And Professor Hill's book is Believing, Our 30-Year Journey to End Gender Violence, and it's now out in paperback. Thank you very much for being with us.